Hi everyone, welcome. Cool. We'll get started. So I want to introduce Dr. Laura Logozzo. She's an aquatic biogeochemist with interests in carbon cycling, water quality, habitat restoration, and protection. She has a master's from CUNY City College, focused on carbon dynamics in wetlands and estuaries, and received her PhD from the Yale School of the Environment in 2022, where she researched riverine dissolved organic matter dynamics. In 2022, she then became the postdoctoral fellow at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, where she researched agricultural impacts on prairie wetlands, which I think she's going to talk about today. And then in 2024, she joined the Hudson River Foundation as an associate scientist, where she now works in her hometown, New York City, on habitat research and restoration in the Hudson River watershed. Laura is also a really good friend of mine, a colleague of many years. We've worked together on a number of projects, including getting the rental field car unstuck from the mud on a wilderness road in the Colorado Rockies, retrieving some dissolved oxygen sensors that our PI had thrown out of the car window to deploy in Vermont in November. Laura, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Taylor. And yes, I would not recommend sticking your arms into freezing cold water to retrieve oxygen sensors. So today I'm going to be presenting on some of the work I did as a postdoc at the University of Lethbridge on agricultural land use impacts to aquatic greenhouse gas emissions from wetlands in the Canadian Prairie pothole region. And this is work that I did in collaboration with Ducks Unlimited Canada, who are my co-authors. This paper just came out about 3 weeks ago, so if you're interested, you can read more later. As many of you probably already know, wetlands provide numerous ecosystem services, such as improving water quality for downstream habitats, providing critical habitat for wildlife, especially waterfowl. They can buffer regional hydrology, which reduces the impacts of both floods and droughts. They're important recreationally, and then most important for this talk, they're very efficient at storing carbon because they're really productive ecosystems that take up a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And because they're so effective at storing carbon, the protection and restoration of wetlands is considered nature-based climate solutions. And in fact, Drever et al. In 2021 showed that the protection of freshwater mineral wetlands was actually a more cost-effective and efficient carbon storage opportunity than wetland restoration, and that's due to avoided carbon losses with wetland loss. This opportunity is particularly prominent in across Canada, but particularly the prairie pothole region, which is down here. Because while 50% of wetlands in the prairie potholes have been lost since European colonization, there's still a really high density of wetlands that remain, but that are under threat of either being degraded or lost, mainly due to agriculture. And just so you can get a picture of what I mean by a lot of wetlands, this is all wetlands in the prairie pothole region. And if you pretty much go anywhere on Google Earth and zoom in on the prairie pothole region, you'll find something like this, and that's exactly how I got this image. So it's the highest density of wetlands, I think, in North America. So wetlands are really efficient at storing carbon, but they also emit greenhouse gases, the three main ones being carbon dioxide, methane, or CH4, which has 34 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide on a 100-year timescale, and then nitrous oxide, which has a 298 times greater warming potential than carbon dioxide. And for freshwater wetlands in particular, they are extremely high sources of methane emissions, although these estimates are pretty uncertain. Approximately half of global methane emissions are from aquatic ecosystems. This is from a paper by Rosentrader et al. In 2021. And of those aquatic emissions, 30% are estimated to be from freshwater wetlands. But like I said, there's a lot of uncertainty about these numbers, and some of that has to do with surrounding land use and the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. So for the prairie pothole region, what we care about is agriculture, because it's one of the largest agricultural producers in Canada. And there are multiple different ways that agriculture could impact wetland properties, such as by fertilizer application that runs off into surrounding wetlands, increasing nutrients that will change the biogeochemistry of those ecosystems, And in Canada, in this region in particular, the two that are probably the most important are phosphorus and ammonium, as these are applied pretty typically as fertilizer. Then you can also have changes to hydrology and soil chemistry, so things like soil organic matter content, which will be lower in the land surrounding wetlands if it's a cropped field with different, depending on crop practices. And then the other thing is that different types of crops have different needs for different elements. So canola, for example, has a really high sulfur need, so that'll change the surrounding soil chemistry. And again, this is particularly important for the prairie pothole region and for the world in general because 65% of freshwater mineral wetlands globally have cropland in their buffer area. So I want to paint a picture of what that looks like for the prairie pothole region in case anyone hasn't been there, which probably most of you haven't. I haven't been there. I had never been anywhere like there until I did my postdoc here. So this is my supervisor. We're in a wetland. This is me. This is the vegetated area of the wetland, the open water portion down here, and then this is just in a wheat field. And you can see all the other wetlands embedded in these cropped fields surrounding the wetland. Over here in the corner, if you see this kind of yellowish area, this is canola. So again, the two highest are like wheat and canola. So that was the basis of our question, which was how do different agricultural land uses affect wetland greenhouse gas emissions? And we actually had two different types of land uses, both of which are technically considered agricultural. So the first is perennially vegetated landscapes, which in this region are generally used for cattle grazing, so it's considered rangeland. And then the other one is cropland, and this was in a variety of different crops, so canola and wheat and soybean were the three main ones. And then under that overarching question, we wanted to know, are there differences in water chemistry across land uses? Do those differences in water chemistry transfer when it comes to greenhouse gas fluxes? And then finally, what are the regional scale drivers of wetland greenhouse gas cycling across this entire region? So in Canada, the prairie pothole region spans 3 provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And it also cuts into the United States, I'm not showing here, but generally mostly North Dakota and South Dakota. And all of this research is part of the Prairie Ecosystem Services Project, which was to estimate greenhouse gas fluxes in agricultural landscapes across Canada. As part of this work, we sampled, in collaboration with Ducks Unlimited Canada, dissolved gas from the open water portion of these wetlands monthly from May to September in 2021. And we did this in 8 sites that were in cropland and 7 to 8 sites that were in perennial landscapes across these 3 regions. So we had a pretty broad view geographically. At each site, we measured a variety of different things. So we measured water chemistry, things like nutrients like total phosphorus, total dissolved nitrogen, nitrate and nitrite, ammonium. We measured dissolved organic carbon concentration, temperature, pH, specific conductivity, and sulfate. And this was all just in the open water portion of the wetland. Then we measured dissolved gas samples in that open water portion using headspace equilibration, and we measured it on a GC, or gas chromatograph. And then we estimated the diffusive flux of all 3 greenhouse gases using wind speed and surface area and an empirical model developed by Klaus and Vachon in 2020. And just for note, the diffusive flux is just the amount of gas that's entering or leaving the wetland, in particular the open water area used by diffusion. And then finally, we converted our 3 greenhouse gases to CO2 equivalents on a 100-year timescale so that we could look at them all together and understand the overall warming potential and total greenhouse gas flux from these wetlands. So getting into our first question, were there differences in water chemistry across land use? So I'm only going to show the parameters which we did see differences. And in this case, for nutrients, which I'm showing on the top, the 2 that we saw significant differences were total phosphorus on the left and then ammonium on the right. And I'm plotting this for wetlands and cropped fields in orange, and then wetlands in perennially vegetated landscapes in blue. And so if you remember back to when I said the two most commonly applied fertilizers in this region are phosphorus and ammonium, those are the two in which we saw differences in the wetland itself. The other differences that we saw in the soil and hydrology sort of category were sulfate concentrations here on the left, and then dissolved organic carbon concentrations here on the right, where cropped fields, wetlands embedded in cropped fields had lower sulfate concentrations than in perennially vegetated landscapes, and also lower DOC concentrations than perennially vegetated landscapes. So I'll talk more about the reason for the sulfur later, but we think it has to do with the high requirement of sulfur by canola. And then for dissolved organic carbon, I think this tends to be typical in cropped landscapes where you're having a turnover of vegetation that's reducing the amount of carbon that could run off into the surrounding wetlands. If we look at all of our parameters together using a principal component analysis, we have principal component 1 on the x-axis, which is mainly associated with total dissolved nitrogen and dissolved organic carbon. And then on principal component 2 axis, we have mostly associated with total phosphorus, and then opposite direction is sulfate. And you can really see the separation across land use when we look at all the data together, where cropland tended to have higher principal component 2s, which was associated with higher phosphorus and lower sulfate, compared to perennially vegetated landscapes, which had higher sulfate and lower total phosphorus. So we did see differences across nutrients and soil chemistry, but does that translate over to greenhouse gas fluxes across these different land uses? So here I'm showing our 3 different greenhouse gases. We have carbon dioxide flux on the left graph, methane flux in the center graph, and then nitrous oxide on the right. And I really want 3 takeaways from these graphs is that both carbon dioxide and methane were sources, the wetlands were sources of carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere, whereas nitrous oxide really switched between being a sink and a source depending on the wetland. And the other takeaway is that although carbon dioxide concentration fluxes were high out of these wetlands, there was no significant difference, only a marginal difference between the 2 land use categories. That, however, was not the case for methane, which, in addition to having high methane fluxes to the atmosphere from these wetlands, there was also a significant difference between wetlands that were embedded in cropland and wetlands that were embedded in perennial landscapes, where the cropped wetlands had significantly higher methane emissions. And if we look at that in CO2 equivalents to look at the overall effects of all 3 greenhouse gases together on the total instantaneous gas flux, which I'm showing here on the left, and the right, but the median is on the left and the mean is on the right. I have carbon dioxide is the green, and then methane is purple. Nitrous oxide is blue, and you can't see it, and that's because the fluxes are essentially 0 in the open water portion, at least. And so what we saw was that the higher methane in cropped landscapes essentially doubled the total greenhouse gas flux in CO2 equivalents from the wetlands in cropland compared to perennial landscapes. And how does this compare in the broader context of methane emissions, both in this region but also globally? So this study only looked at the aquatic-only emissions. So this is just from the open water portion, and that's what I'm showing here in the blue circles. The circles are the weighted means, and then the lines here are the min and max values, so you can look at the amount of variability. And I'm showing it for different regions and then also different types of wetlands. So sorry, there's a lot going on, but I'm going to walk everyone through it. So the 2 red circles show where our study falls, and in general, as I showed here, the perennial wetlands had pretty high methane emissions. One thing I forgot to say, this is just methane emissions. So the perennial wetlands had high methane emissions, but pretty comparable to other types of wetlands in the region, including restored wetlands and also even agricultural reservoirs, which I'm showing here. Whereas the cropped wetlands were really high above anything else and had also fairly high variability compared to other types of wetlands. If we take into account the vegetated portion of wetlands, which this whole wetland here in green is showing that, really you're going to get lower methane emissions because the vegetated portion tends to be less of a source of emissions compared to the open water, and so you're averaging over a larger area. And this is based off of a review of different studies for these whole wetland fluxes. And so comparing between the two land uses at the whole wetland scale shows actually not that much of a difference, and also lower than other types of wetland emissions like subtropical wetlands, boreal, temperate. The PPR tends to be on the lower side of that, and I can talk a little bit about why that might be later. But this is actually good news because it doesn't necessarily mean that the wetlands in croplands are really high hot spots. We really need to look at the whole wetland picture to understand the carbon storage potential in particular. So what are the drivers of wetland greenhouse gas cycling in the prairie pothole region? This might get repetitive at this point, but as we showed before, the two parameters that had big differences across our land use types were total phosphorus and sulfate. And so because methane was the gas in which we saw differences across land use, I'm only going to talk about methane. But I'm showing the partial pressure of methane here on the left graph and partial pressure versus sulfate on the right graph. And what we showed was that as sulfur concentrations were higher in the cropped wetlands, so were methane partial pressure, which is equivalent or similar to methane concentrations in the water. And then we saw the opposite trend for sulfate, where wetlands in croplands had higher sulfate concentrations, which was associated with lower sulfate concentrations, which was associated with higher methane concentrations. So why might that be? So talking about phosphorus, again, this is generally added as a nutrient amendment, as fertilizer. And what we think is that with increased phosphorus loading into wetlands, we have more primary production that's producing more labile organic matter that can be used for methane production. And then the secondary way that phosphorus can impact methane production is by limiting the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water column. So with more primary production, the respiration of those primary producers along with their eventual decomposition can cause hypoxia, and that limits the amount of methane oxidation, which is one of the main processes by which methane is removed from the water column. And then for sulfate, again, this is related to, we think, crop uptake by canola and other crops. And this mainly is associated with oxidation reduction or redox changes in the water column. So if you have a lot of sulfate, you tend to have sulfate reduction that dominates over methane production, in particular. Sorry, I don't know what I was going to say with that. And then you also have methane oxidized or removed from the water column during sulfate reduction. And so these are the two mechanisms by which sulfate is potentially reducing both the amount of methane produced, but also the amount of increasing the amount of methane removed. And so we wanted to look a little bit more into the sulfate question. And so this is work that was done by Sarah Valizadeh, who is a postdoc at the University of Lethbridge now, where we did a lab experiment to look at the amount of methane produced under different types of salinity, specifically sulfate and sodium. And so it's a pretty simple experiment where we went out to a wetland, we collected sediment and water from that wetland, and then we added it to a syringe with the three-way stopcock that was sealed off to the atmosphere, and we added nitrogen gas, which is an inert gas, and kind of creates that anoxic conditions that you really need for methane production. So this was the control treatment, and then we also had treatments where we added two different salts in different concentrations. So we had NaCl or magnesium sulfate, and we added them in different concentrations, and we allowed it to sit for, I think, a week. And so the results of that study, as simple as it was, were pretty striking. So on the left, on the y-axis, I'm showing methane production in these vials, and then salinity on the x-axis. So this is the different concentrations of salts that we added for NaCl, which is black, and then magnesium sulfate, which is red. And so actually in both treatments, we saw a decrease in the amount of methane produced over time, although there was a slight increase at first with the NaCl treatment. But that's pretty stark comparison to the magnesium sulfate treatment, where even at the lowest concentration of salt, which was only 0.45 ppt, there was a huge drop-off in the amount of methane produced in these like mini mesocosms, I guess. And so again, I think, as I said before, we think that there's going to be some influence of salt that's influencing like microbial viability and like microbial stress, but the magnesium sulfate is more probably redox related rather than just microbial stress. So in summary, we showed that wetlands and crop landscapes had higher total phosphorus and lower sulfate concentrations than in perennial landscapes, and that these factors together increased the methane fluxes in cropped wetlands. And then finally, we showed that the increase in methane doubled the total greenhouse gas flux of cropped wetlands compared to those perennial wetlands. So there's a lot of implications related to this work, specifically that cropped wetlands may actually have a lower carbon storage potential than wetlands in perennial landscapes. But like I said, we can't actually say that for sure without looking at the emergent vegetation as well, and that's because we need really a complete budget for both parts of the wetland to understand the overall implications for carbon storage, especially given that the vegetation is where carbon storage is most likely to be occurring within the wetland. The other thing that's important to note, and especially for the work that I do now at the Hudson River Foundation, is that even if these wetlands aren't particularly good at storing carbon, they still provide numerous other ecosystem services that shouldn't be ignored. So like water quality, like habitat, like recreational value. And so we have to look at these ecosystems as holistically, not just from their utility of storing carbon. And then finally, this provides some information about nutrient management and how we can manage surrounding landscapes to be able to inform the manage the surrounding ecosystems to be able to inform or manage for reduced methane emissions if that is what the goal of your wetland is, I guess. I want to go back to this term that I talked about, that the fact that we need a whole wetland budget to be able to really understand carbon storage potential, because that is another project that I did at the University of Lethbridge, trying to do a case study looking at this particular question. So in this project, we used a whole ecosystem carbon budget to explore whether a wetland restored with agro-industrial effluent is a net carbon sink or source. And this is work that I did with folks at the University of Lethbridge, and it was a really collaborative project because we used a lot of different approaches. So I'll talk about what I mean by agro-industrial effluent, and it's not going to be nice, unfortunately. So the wetland that we looked at is Frank Lake. This is a wetland in the Prairie Pothole region in southern Alberta. And one thing about the Prairie Pothole region is that it experiences really significant wetting and drying climate cycles that are going to influence the hydrology of these wetlands pretty significantly. And I didn't really talk about that in the last project since it was just over a one-year study, but it's really relevant for this one in particular. So this is Frank Lake. It's a pretty large wetland complex, and this is Frank Lake in July of 1951 during a particularly wet period where it's really overflowing into the surrounding landscape. And then this is Frank Lake 30 years later in July of 1983, and the wetland has entirely dried up. This is a combination of both prolonged drought, but also land use change, which I think it was kind of like encroaching agriculture and then use, redirecting water for agricultural use was the main purpose. And then this wetland was restored in 1989 in partnership with Ducks Unlimited Canada with wastewater from a beef processing plant, so essentially a slaughterhouse, as well as water from local municipalities that this was treated wastewater, but it's still wastewater. And since then, it's been shown that Frank Lake is providing numerous different benefits, like nutrient removal. So in particular, this basin here, which I'll show later, is removing a lot of phosphorus from wastewater. So that's good for downstream water quality. And it also provides really critical waterfowl habitat, believe it or not, and it's one of the most popular birding destinations in southern Alberta. But what about for carbon storage? So that was the goal of this project. We used a net ecosystem carbon budget to explore whether Frank Lake, again restored with wastewater, is a net carbon sink or source. And so according to net ecosystem carbon budgets, this was first, I think, defined by Chapin et al. In 2006, and then a follow-up study by Webb et al. In 2019 used a similar approach. The boundaries for your ecosystem are user-defined. It's essentially whatever you want it to be. So in this case, our boundaries included the entire wetland complex, both the vegetated portion and the open water portion. Other context is that we did this, we studied this wetland during a prolonged drought, so 2021 to 2022. And this is going to come back later as to kind of understand some of the mechanisms behind what we saw. So I want to talk a little bit about how the water moves through Frank Lake and the different characteristics of it. Again, it's located in southern Alberta, which I'm showing here in the Old Demand watershed. It's pretty close to the Rocky Mountains, so you have a nice view of the Rockies out on the prairies. And there's two open water basins and then one almost entirely vegetated basin. So this first basin is where the effluent comes in. And during drought, although you have these two creeks that in theory would add water, during a drought, the flow in from these creeks is essentially zero. And so really the only source of water is the effluent. And then you have flow between the basins through these sort of outflows. So you have basin 1 and then basin 2, and then there is outflow into basin 3 and like a small stream that runs through. Basin 3 then connects to the rest of the watershed downstream. So the net ecosystem carbon budget, essentially how it works is you add up all of your influx of carbon into the system and then subtract the outflux of carbon out of the system. And so I'll walk through those fluxes that we're considering for this budget. So first, we have our net ecosystem productivity, or NEP, which is the exchange of carbon from the emergent vegetation. This can be positive or negative, so it can either be mainly importing carbon or exporting carbon. I don't know, that's probably not the right term, but. We also have some internal fluxes which are important for understanding the mechanisms that are occurring within the wetland, but are not part of the budget because it's within the boundaries of our ecosystem. So we have carbon burial, and then we have lateral export from the emergent vegetation to the open water. For this very strange wetland, the main source of carbon into the open water is the effluent, where you have dissolved organic carbon, particulate organic carbon, and then dissolved inorganic carbon. I said we have stream flows, but again, these are essentially zero during a drought. We also have outflow to the downstream, which during a drought is also essentially zero, although there was actually some outflow, so I'll talk about that later when I pull all the budget together. And then finally, the term that I measured in the last study, which is the exchange of greenhouse gases, in this case, just carbon greenhouse gas, so CO2 and methane, from the open water to the atmosphere. Last internal flux is carbon burial, again, in the open water and sediment. So to address these across boundaries, this vegetation and open water fluxes, we really need multiple different approaches. So the first, for emergent vegetation, we used an eddy covariance flux tower to estimate net ecosystem productivity. And this covariance flux tower was located in Basin 3, which was the entirely vegetated portion. So we should really only be getting vegetation fluxes in the eddy covariance flux tower with very little influence, ideally, from the open water. And then we also measured above ground biomass in basically all these colored regions we see around here. So we had biomass measurements from right around where the eddy covariance flux tower was, and we could create a relationship between NEP and the above ground biomass that we could then apply to the rest of the basin. So that's what we did. We scaled NEP based on biomass to the entire complex, and we scaled it to the vegetated area, which we derived from remote sensing. So that's what I'm showing in the green. This is the vegetated area derived by remote sensing. And so again, this is predominantly the vegetated area, and then these two basins are predominantly open water. And then lastly, to measure the open water fluxes, we did greenhouse gas flux chamber transects, which we paired with grab samples that we took seasonally, because these transects we only took 2 to 3 times a year. So we took twice in 2021 and then 3 times in 2022. And then we took grab samples monthly, so we could look at the spatial variability, but also the seasonal variability over the time period. I didn't talk about the effluent flux in because that's pretty easy to calculate. We know the amount of effluent coming in from Cargill Foods, which is the group that is actually using releasing the wastewater into effluent, and we just take grab samples of the amount of carbon within the effluent, and it's pretty consistent year-round because it's just wastewater. Okay, so the takeaway for the vegetation is that overall the vegetation was taking up carbon from the atmosphere, which is what we would expect. And if we want to break it down just to understand the variability across the basins, as we would expect, the greatest amount of vegetation was in that basin 3, which was entirely vegetated with no open water. But actually the biomass in basin 3 was pretty low, and that's because this was a drought and there was no nearby water. So basins 1 and 2, even though they had less vegetation overall, the biomass was higher. This again gets into the utility of wetlands as buffering the regional hydrology during droughts and floods. And then when we add that all together into net ecosystem production, again, this is positive. So overall, we're seeing as a whole, the wetland is taking up carbon from the atmosphere, at least the vegetated portion, and it was pretty similar across the 2 years, although 2021 had slightly lower NEP. When we get to the open water emissions, I'm showing just results from our transects now. So we had 2 transects in June and August, and on the left I'm showing carbon dioxide fluxes. And then 2022, we had 3 months that we collected, June, August, and October. And then I'm showing methane, the same plots on the right. So we interpolated across the whole basin using a nearest neighbor approach, but we sampled on the black dots here. Big takeaway from here is just as we saw for our other wetlands, the open water is a source of both CO2 and methane to the atmosphere, but it's pretty highly variable spatially throughout the basin. And in particular, Basin 1, which is what is receiving the effluent, had the greatest emissions, whereas Basin 2 tended to be lower across all of our sampling times. One other important thing to note is that in August of 2022, we saw that the wetland actually became a sink for carbon dioxide. So it was taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, especially in Basin 1. I'm not going to talk about the scaling, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But we scaled that seasonally to get a flux for the whole year. And when we put all of that together, we have a cohesive budget for the wetland. So a few takeaways from this. As I said, the vegetated area is taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as a whole. We have inputs of DIC, dissolved inorganic carbon, and then DOC and POC to the open water. We have some outflow, which I showed here, but really the biggest flux that dominates everything is the amount of carbon dioxide that's being emitted from the open water. And this is much greater than the amount of methane that's being emitted from the open water. And so putting this all together shows that there's an imbalance in our budget and that overall this wetland is acting as a source of carbon to the atmosphere, not a sink of carbon, at the scale of about 1,500 megagrams of carbon per year. So as I said, the wetland is acting as a source of carbon, mainly as CO2, but secondarily as methane emissions. The important context is that this is during a drought period, and some other work by Jackie Zhao in our lab showed that during the wet period, the open water portion of the wetland was actually producing organic matter. And so what we're thinking could be happening is that this wetland is accumulating organic matter during wet periods and then processing it during these dry periods where it's more hydrologically disconnected from the rest of the watershed. The other really important thing to note is that this isn't a normal wetland. Most of the emissions derived from this wetland are probably derived from the effluent itself. And so the emissions from this effluent is going to be emitted to the atmosphere, whether it's in the wetland or it's downstream. This wetland is not a new source of carbon to the atmosphere. And it's really the residence time, so the amount of time the effluent and the water is spending in the wetland, and how connected or not the wetland is to the rest of the watershed, that determines whether this carbon is being emitted upstream or downstream. It's just a matter of where, not when. And then finally, one thing that I didn't really talk about before was that although the wetland as a whole is acting as a source of carbon, some of those emissions were offset by the uptake of carbon by emergent vegetation. And so it begs the question, can we actually manage these wetlands, especially if they're being used to treat wastewater, to reduce the amount of emissions by enhancing emergent vegetation growth? So I want to tie everything together, and I realized I talk really fast, so I'm only 30 minutes in, but hopefully it was interesting. Overall, I wanted to say that wetlands and their upland land use can be managed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So from two different perspectives, we can, one, reduce the amount of nutrient loading, especially in croplands. A lot of crop management practices in the region are not very conducive to reducing runoff. So for example, it's pretty common even now to add fertilizer on top of snow, and then when it melts, it just basically runs directly off into wetlands. So even something as small as the timing of when fertilizer is applied could have significant impacts on methane emissions from these wetlands. I also want to connect this to some of the work that I'm doing now at the Hudson River Foundation. We have, as part of the Hudson River Foundation, the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program. Works with New York State, New York City, and New Jersey to reduce the amount of nutrient loading, especially from wastewater, into the surrounding harbor. And so although this is a completely different system and completely different wetlands, there may be other benefits to nutrient removal, including potentially decreases to greenhouse gas emissions. The other way is that by increasing vegetated areas in wetlands, we could basically offset any of the greenhouse gas emissions, whether that be from wastewater or otherwise. And this is also something that I'm working on at the Hudson River Foundation as we work to try and restore wetlands, and particularly the vegetated portions of coastal wetlands in the region. Another interesting thing that came up from this work, and also other work out of my lab, is that higher salinity wetlands have lower methane production and in general lower methane emissions. And I think this is something that is fairly well known in the coastal wetland community, but it's not really talked about as much in the freshwater wetland community, exactly because it's called freshwater. But the wetlands out in the prairies are inland water bodies that are variably salty depending on just local hydrology and soil chemistry. And so really trying to model or understand the effects of salinity on methane for inland waters is really important. The other thing is thinking from a management perspective, and the work I do now is that while coastal wetlands may have lower methane emissions, they are more at risk for sea level rise, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that they're better at storing carbon than inland water bodies. We have to think about it holistically and also think about the future of these wetlands and whether they can accrete at a faster rate than sea level rise. And then this is something that I'm not working on now, but I'm always thinking about, which is, can we manage wetlands both for carbon storage and for habitat value? Is there an inherent trade-off with how we manage these ecosystems with these two different services, or can they be used in tandem? There was some preliminary work out of my lab that was trying to get at that question of whether wetlands that are sources of greenhouse gases, are they also hotspots for biodiversity and vice versa? With that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, all of my funding agencies, my co-authors, and the Bogard Lab at the University of Lethbridge, who were instrumental to a lot of this work. I had the easy task of just inheriting a data set that was already collected by all these wonderful people. So I'd just like to thank them. And with that, I think I can take questions.
All right, so I'll repeat the questions, and if I forget, just remind me.
Okay.
Yeah, Sarah?
Yeah, that's, oh, sorry.
So the question was if Laura can talk about the vegetation in the prairie potholes and if the non-native influences things. Carbon fluxes, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the vegetation in the region is Spartina for the most part, which is native to the area. And cattails is the other one. I think here is maybe cattails. But we don't have like Phragmites, like there's no Phragmites out there like we have here on the East Coast. We didn't necessarily look at the impacts of the vegetation type on methane fluxes, and I would say just like anecdotally, most of the wetland vegetation looked pretty similar across the two land use categories and also just in general at most of the ones we sampled. But it's a good question, and I know like there's conversations about that all the time with Phragmites out here. And actually some maybe evidence that Phragmites might be better at resisting sea level rise, which has other types of implications. But I don't know about the greenhouse gas fluxes, but I know it's definitely a hot topic and something that folks are thinking about.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know your name. I think we've met. Yep. Jazz, yeah.
So I'm curious about the crop wetlands, the area around the open water.
Yeah.
It looks like in your image there's some kind of a buffer before the crops start. I wonder how variable that is and how that might influence some of the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
So Jazz asked about the buffer around the open water and if that influences the emissions.
Yeah, great question. I would say it's like very highly variable, even in the perennial wetlands, which are used as rangeland. Like sometimes it's truly just like mud and then open water because the cattle are actually grazing the wetland itself. I unfortunately didn't get to go out to any of the sites in Saskatchewan or Manitoba, so I don't know what it looked like there, but I would say it is pretty variable, even just in Alberta. I just want to go back to the image to see if like, can I fast forward? It doesn't matter. But yeah, I would say it's very variable. Also, things like the size of the wetland were really variable, which I think will impact the amount of runoff and the width of the vegetated area of the wetland. It's just not something we looked at, but.
I wonder if that variability might account for some of the variability we saw in the methane emissions as well.
Yeah, no, there was huge variability, and like even the relationship with other parameters wasn't that strong because I think of like just the diversity of wetland size and other characteristics.
How much sulfur did they put on this canola, and were you surprised that there was lower sulfate in the crop, the row crop?
The question is how much sulfur was put on the canola?
So I think for the most part, they were not amending any of the soils with sulfur. And this is just in conversation with like local farmers in the area. Most of the amendments are, like I said, phosphorus and then ammonium-based fertilizers. I would say I was surprised by the fact that sulfate concentrations were lower in cropland. And that it was consistent across like all three provinces, even though they probably have very different crop management practices. But it is important context because even if they were to add sulfate, that in theory would reduce methane emissions. So that is a potentially like another solution to manage the wetlands or the surrounding land to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah.
Do you have any sense at all of how that would have, on average, influenced your picture of the kind of greenhouse gas balance of those, or the carbon balance of those wetlands?
Yeah.
So Chris asked if burial in the prairie pothole regions might have accounted for a change in the budget in greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I think that would explain the imbalance probably because I think what could be happening is the carbon's being stored up in the sediment maybe during a wet period. And even like the surrounding vegetated soils. And then as those soils like dry out and are more exposed to the atmosphere and other processes, like it could be, that carbon could be the source of that those open water fluxes in particular. So I think it would be useful to characterizing that imbalance. And we do have some data looking at burial, but for other nutrients, not for carbon. So I think we have like phosphorus. We have like phosphorus information that's showing that the wetland is storing phosphorus over time. I think we were going to try and scale it up, or not scale, but like estimate carbon based off of other elements, and we just decided that the fluxes were too uncertain to actually account for that. But it's still in progress, the work. That's not published, so it is something that we're thinking about including.
And then my other question, the thing you said towards the end about the carbon's coming out of the plant, the processing plant there, regardless, and so it's a question of whether, when or where it's going to be, emitted to the atmosphere.
Yeah.
That struck me, and I wondered whether there are ways, like if you can increase the residence time and hold it in a place longer where its fate is maybe more likely to be something like long-term burial rather than off-gassing, then maybe there are ways to kind of manage that carbon off-gassing from the effluent. Is there, like how crazy is that? Are there any ways that you might actually try to manage?
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
I know.
Yeah, so Chris asked basically if you can, I guess, modify the residence time somehow of these, of the lake to enhance burial as opposed to just sort of redistributing where the carbon emissions happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say overall what we've seen, and I think even some of like Taylor's work has shown that like the longer the residence time, the more the carbon is processed and emitted, if that's true, Taylor. Yeah. So it would have to be, and I will say a lot of the stuff coming in is like mostly in the dissolved phase rather than particulate. And a lot of, it's mostly either DOC, but yeah, the large majority is DIC. So it's kind of already been processed, most likely. So it's really, it would be challenging. You'd have to think about how to enhance burial. And then also like how long-term of a solution is that? Because that's something that they're seeing with phosphorus is like the wetland's really good at removing phosphorus up until it reaches like a saturation point in the sediment. Then it's going to start releasing phosphorus to the open water. So even like the wetland as a treatment wetland is not a viable long-term solution to wastewater.
What's up?
Following up, I also have a question about the wastewater.
Yeah.
Do all the microbes get nuked in the wastewater treatment, or is it introducing strange critters to the water?
That's a great question. I know it's highly chlorinated, so chlorine coming in is extremely high into the wetland. But I don't think it gets nuked. But I also haven't heard much about like introduction of other microbes, especially from like a slaughterhouse where like I don't know what's in there, but it's a good question.
Yeah, Kathy?
I also had a question about the sulfur results. Is anybody looking at methylation of mercury in these wetlands? My recollection is that it's sulfate-producing bacteria that produce the amount of mercury.
Yeah.
So Kathy asked if there's methylation of mercury happening.
Great question. No one from my lab. I'm trying to think if we have any collaborators that are working on it. I don't think so. But I know like Frank Lake is like has a huge, like it has a lot of long-term data, and there's a lot of folks in the region that are working on that area. So, and also Frank Lake, I didn't mention it, but it has a lot of sulfate. So it could be a good like case study to understand the effects on methylmercury, but we don't have that data.
Great talk. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thanks.
I was curious, I know you don't have perennial, from the first study, perennial without grazers, but I was just thinking about how grazers are changing where carbon and nutrients are showing up in the landscape through their dung, and if there's anybody who's looked at sort of that distribution of that and how that's ending up in the water compared to without grazers.
Yeah.
So Amy asked if grazers are redistributing nutrients through their dung.
Great question. I would say there actually were some sites that were not impacted by grazers, so we kind of lumped all of the perennially vegetated sites together, even the ones that like were intact or undisturbed. I didn't see any differences like noticeable differences between those sites and the ones that were grazed. But I'm almost positive that there will be, just from like you can see in the landscape the way that disturbance affects everything, including like plant growth along the edge of the wetland was like mud in rangeland versus like vegetated. So it's, yeah, definitely an interesting question.
Questions also.
Yeah.
I was interested in the finding, and then you talked about it at the end, that methane emissions were lower with higher salinity.
Yes.
Is that like something that you also saw out in the field? Like, was there a gradient of salinity in the prairie potholes, and did that then in turn correlate with emissions or methane production?
Yeah, I'm waiting for you to repeat the question. You just said it. Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily a gradient in that every wetland, even if they were right next to each other, had like very distinct differences in salinity. But the salinity mostly in this region is sulfate. So the results that we were seeing in sulfate kind of mimicked what we saw in like the specific conductivity for the most part. And I didn't cite it here, but there's a paper by Matt Bogart, actually Cynthia Sued, who is my co-author on this paper and also part of the Bogart lab, that looked at the effects of salinity as a whole on methane emissions from the prairie pothole region and found something like if you don't account for salinity, you're overestimating methane by 80%, which is pretty significant. So it is definitely something that, like, I think all inland water folks, if you're interested in methane, should be thinking about. It may not be as important out here where like salinity in inland waters isn't that dramatic, but there are areas like the prairie pothole regions which are like highly saline and also like highly variable depending on just like local, like very localized hydrology.
My other question was, in Frank Lake, I guess part one is like, how was there a flux that you just sort of had, like, did you have to balance the budget by basically just assuming a flux that you didn't measure? And then my follow-up is, did you account for ebullition? And if so, like, what is the role of that?
Yeah, great questions. And actually something that I forgot to mention is that we did not account for ebullition in either of our studies. So the emissions from the prairie pothole region work that showed higher in cropped, and in the open water, we expect that to be even higher. In general, ebullition tends to be like similar in magnitude to diffusive fluxes, so it could be like double the methane emissions than what we've shown here if you're actually accounting for ebullition. We had some work from a PhD student in our lab that was looking at ebullition in the prairie potholes, and it was just like very variable. That data is not like fully in yet, so I don't know the results yet. But we did not account for ebullition in Frank Lake. We actually deployed flux chambers to measure ebullition, and the wind is so strong out on the prairies, and especially Frank Lake, which is open water, that we lost every single one of them, and they were out for like 2 days. So we have to kind of think about like how to actually get at that question. In terms of the imbalance of the budget, like I will say it was bugging me so much that the balance was not in budget, but I guess that is kind of like a normal thing when you're just looking at a snapshot in time, is like you're not getting the entire picture because these ecosystems are storing and then re-emitting, and the processes can vary, especially in these like wet and dry cycles, so significantly that it's kind of just something you have to accept unless you're doing like a longer term study where you can get like a more holistic view. But I don't think we're missing like we have like groundwater estimates that seems to be pretty minimal of like carbon influx in, so I don't think we're missing like anything major at this point. Yeah.
Nobody has any more questions. There's no questions online unless somebody wants to chime in. Just give them a moment, but I don't think anybody's coming. So if everybody wants to join me in thanking Laura once again for her great talk, and see you at lunch.
Thanks, everyone.